Okay, well, I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone. It's Jenny LeRae. Welcome to today's Research America Alliance member call. I think by now we're used to the mechanics of these calls, but if you need a refresher, we have a slide on the screen, and it explains that you need to how to mute and unmute your line, and also how to ask questions. You type your questions in the question box. You can do that at any time. And my colleague Terry will be asking those questions at the end. And for those of you dialing in by phone, we'll open up the phone lines after the presentation, and you can hit *6 to unmute your line if you'd like to ask a question. So we are thrilled to have two terrific guest speakers today. Each of them will share how their organizations are working hard to battle COVID-19. We flipped the order at the last minute due to schedule changes. I'm really pleased to introduce Scott Whitaker, our first speaker. He's the president and CEO of AdvaMed. Prior to leading AdvaMed, he had various leadership roles at Bio and also served as chief of staff and assistant secretary for Ledge Affairs at HHS. Scott, we look forward to hearing how the medical device and diagnostic sector has organized to combat the pandemic. Turning it over to you.
Well, very good. Thank you, Jenny. And thank you to you and Ellie and everyone at Research America for all the great work that you do, not just in this issue, but year-round. It's such a great organization and such a strong entity, and we're glad to be partners with you. So I want to, first of all, thank you for your leadership and partnership and your work as well. So maybe I'll start, just for those that aren't that familiar with AdvaMed, to give you a little bit of an overview of who we are and who we represent, and then maybe lead into a conversation about what we're doing right now, and then would welcome a Q&A session after that. So for those of you who don't know AdvaMed well, we represent the entire medical technology industry, the traditional medical device makers, but also the diagnostics companies as well, and all the new emerging healthcare companies that are in the health technology space. And so it's a very diverse set of companies that we have the good fortune of representing. It's particularly interesting now because as we're fighting collectively as a nation and around the world the pandemic of COVID-19, our companies have been on the front lines of dealing with this sort of across all aspects of it. So we have the diagnostic tools that are being used to diagnose the disease. We have many of the medical equipment and supplies that are in hospitals to help treat the patients who are suffering from this disease. And then most of our companies produce personal protective equipment of many varieties to help support and protect the nurses and doctors and healthcare workers that are on the front line, the heroes on the front line of doing the work to take care of these patients in hospitals and in other aspects throughout the communities that are impacted by it. So we've had a front seat in this fight, and you never want something like this to bring us all together, but this fight certainly has brought this industry together to help fight it. So there are two aspects of what we do now that have been very, very much front and center. First is on the diagnostic side, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But first, it was really on the personal protective equipment and the ventilator-specific equipment that our companies manufacture. And so for those of you who, and I'm sure most of you have watched the conversation and the dialogue that has occurred, there was a tremendous fear early on that there may not be enough ventilators in the system to help manage the capacity issues that existed across the U.S., particularly in New York, where the problem was very, very acute. So our companies were very deeply engaged with the federal government, with FEMA, with HHS, and the White House Task Force to try to scale up the work we were doing to speed up the manufacturing, primarily of ventilators, but also personal protective equipment as well. Just to give you a sense of the scale there and what we've done and what we're continuing to do, in a typical week in a non-pandemic situation, collectively this industry would manufacture between 600 and 700 ventilators per week to meet the regular demand inside the hospital and the healthcare system in the U.S. But since COVID hit us, we've had to scale up dramatically. And as of last week, we were somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 ventilators that the industry collectively was producing every week. And then we're tracking up to about 7,000 or 8,000, hopefully by the end of this month or early next month, to continue to meet the demand. The hope, of course, is that all of those ventilators we're manufacturing won't be necessary, with the possibility, remote though it may be, that the disease regresses a little bit. We don't have the onslaught that we anticipated. But we're continuing to prepare as if the crisis is going to move across the country and scale up production of these ventilators. There are two types of ventilators, to oversimplify it. There are those that are very, very complicated in the ICU units that are used in critical care cases to help people who are really struggling with the disease. Those are really complicated and difficult to make. I was on a television interview recently. Someone asked me how many component parts exist in those products. There's about 15 to 1,700 depending on the product. So it's a pretty complicated machine. And so scaling up manufacturing of that has been a challenge for us. There's also the non-invasive ventilators that are used outside of ICU to help patients who are in the early stages or coming off an invasive ventilator. And so our companies are manufacturing and scaling up that as well. You've seen some of the partnerships probably that we've had with car manufacturing companies, Ford, GM, Tesla, and others. Most of the work that they're doing is either to help us with component parts or to build the less invasive machines and have them available as well to help with the healthcare need in the hospitals. And so we've had a tremendous amount of focus on that over the course of the past few weeks, and deep collaboration with the White House, initially with HHS, and then moving to FEMA when they started managing the response. And then our primary work with FEMA recently has been to help understand better the allocation schemes and how we can get the right ventilators to the right locations to meet the need. And so that's been a huge focus for us. And I must admit, though they're criticized oftentimes, my interactions with FEMA, HHS, FDA, and the task force have been very good. And they're very responsive, and it's been encouraging to most of our companies who have been in this space. Then the next thing that we've turned to is really on the diagnostic side. And again, where our companies are right on the front line of dealing with this challenge. As you've heard from so many different people recently, in order to get, whether it's Congress, the White House, or the media in general, the sense is in order to get people back to work and reopen the economy, there needs to be a certain level of testing that's available to the average citizen. And we're looking at that in two ways. One is PCR testing, or the front-end testing, to determine whether or not you have COVID-19, that you have a live virus in you. That is already ongoing, and we've scaled up dramatically on that side. The next phase is really on the blood test, or the serology test, to understand who has had the disease and what level of immunity they have in order to determine whether or not they could go back to work and if they're protected. The work on the serology side is very active and ongoing in an aggressive way. I was on a call with Dr. Hahn, the FDA commissioner, just about an hour ago, and we were talking through some of the issues and challenges we have on the regulatory side. But there are two pieces of that that are really important. From our perspective, what our companies will do, will manufacture the tests in order to make that determination. But then you have the science of it, the scientists, the doctors, the government agencies that give you a better read as to whether or not a certain level of immunity or exposure prevents the infection from reoccurring in folks. And that's not work that our companies do directly, but we'll be relying on others to do that. So that's a focus of much of our work right now, scaling up manufacturing on the front end, the PCR test, and then developing these new serology tests with hopefully a great degree of accuracy and efficacy to ensure that those tests are available broadly. And then, of course, in the personal protective equipment area, where our companies are doing so much work, and we're getting tremendous support from other industries outside of just the traditional medical device and technology companies, to make sure that there are enough masks and gowns and other necessary components and to protect the doctors and physicians who are treating these patients. An important level of workforce as well. And the scale at which you have to increase that is just dramatic. And we've seen that in New York, where either you had shortages initially or they were concerned about shortages and you had to manufacture to such a tremendous scale. The second part of that, which has also been an interesting component that most people aren't aware of, is making sure that those products are sterile when they go into the hospitals. And then if you need to reuse, to make sure there's a sterilization process in place to re-sterilize things when you need to go back in after a second for a second round of treatment in an emergency room or in a hospital more broadly. And so a lot of work continues to be done there. It was just announced last week. We have a couple companies who created essentially a sterilization process for masks so that masks can be reused, and which is a really important development, and the ability to do that on a pretty massive scale is increasing as well. So as I said at the outset, you never want to have a crisis like that hit the country, but I will say, being a part of the medtech industry, it's been encouraging how well private sector and the public sector have worked to create some solutions for the problem that we have. It was mentioned earlier, in a previous life, I was at HHS, and so I had a time as chief of staff there, and we were on the front end of dealing with some of these 18 years ago. And I've often said since that time, as much as you would hope that the federal government would be fully prepared, oftentimes we're not fully prepared. The question is, how do we respond? And I think in this case, the government's responded quite well. Some gaps, but we've responded pretty well. So with that, Jenny, maybe I'll pause and open it up for any questions.
Thanks, Scott. That was terrific. What a great overview of what you and your members are doing. Terry, do we have any questions?
Yes, one question has come in. Scott, you mentioned challenges on the regulatory side with regards to the serology tests. Can you say a little bit more about what those are?
So there's two aspects of that. One is making sure that we understand the information that the FDA needs to validate the quality of a product. And so we're working on that with the FDA right now, and that has improved. Oftentimes during a normal course, it will take you months to get all that information straight. And the good news is they're responding very quickly with the technical information they need to manufacture a test like this. The other challenge we've had is to get samples from labs and from university research entities that we can use to validate the test and scale up the test. And so that's not in any way a criticism of anyone. It's just that when you're doing something new like this, you have to have that type of collaboration. And so that's one of the things we've been asking FDA and the White House Task Force to work with us on, is to help connect us with the research entities that are doing some of this, have some of this basic information that we need access to. And that coordination really helps us get a better, more quality test and then scale up as quickly as we can. So those are a couple of the issues that we have right now. The other challenge we've had is exporting from China some of the tests that have been developed over there. That's been a bit of a challenge for us. And we're starting to see our way through that, but there's not a clear path yet. So that's been tough.
Terrific, Scott. Terry, I think we have some more questions.
We sure do. Here's a question about mask sterilization. Does this best practices use vaporous hydrogen peroxide?
Yeah, so there was some discussion around whether or not we would use ethylene oxide, which is traditionally used on the front end of most medical supplies when they go into the hospital setting. And there's some controversy about what the best process would be, but hydrogen peroxide is the standard that the new company, it's not a new company, but the new sterilization product uses. And it has shown to be very effective. FDA has validated the effectiveness of it. And so that's the focus of this reuse or re-sterilization process.
Great. And I have a question here from our very own President and CEO, Mary Woolley. She says, thanks for a great overview. Looking forward, can you speculate on what the medtech industry and the public sector have learned that will change the conduct and pace of innovation in the future?
So, Mary, thanks for being on, and thanks for your leadership and all you do. I appreciate it. You know, we've learned a lot. I think it's a little too early to know exactly what we've learned. One of the things we've learned, I think, that has been very beneficial is the emergency use authorization process at FDA and the quality of that process and the speed at which FDA can now move as a result of that. And that has proven to be tremendously effective and gives our companies some comfort that they can go through a process and get a valid test or a valid product or scale up manufacturing in a way necessary to meet the demand. The other thing I would say, and this is not a criticism of this administration, the previous administration, or anyone else, one of the things that I've recommended early on was that we do maybe a more aggressive job of stockpiling more, particularly medical equipment, so that in the event of another pandemic or another major public health need, that we don't have to scale up as quickly at time, right? And so that's been a bit of a challenge. And I think we could probably collectively afterwards look back and say, had we known this is the level that we wish we would have had on hand, personal protective equipment, of ventilators, of other medical equipment and supplies as well. And so I think that's a learning that all of us could benefit from going forward. And then the last thing I would say, which is very general, the importance of having confidence from the public sector to the private sector, from the private sector to the public sector, that we can partner together to find solutions. It's not just the private sector doing it. It's not just the public sector doing it. It's both of us. And I think that collaboration has worked well. And I think it's a really important lesson for us all going forward.
Terrific. Terry, do we have additional questions?
Oh, yes, definitely. Lots of questions coming in. And thank you, everyone, for submitting them. Again, we'll try to get to as many as we can. Can you talk a little more, Scott, about efforts to reduce false positive and false negative COVID-19 diagnostic tests?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And a lot of that is on the FDA, not to put a burden on them. And again, I think they've been fantastic. But setting a certain level of standard that we try to meet is important to ensure the validity of the test or the efficacy of the test. And they have set it at a reasonably high level. The tricky part, of course, is when you're in an emergency setting, it's hard to get to perfect. And so there is ongoing concern of maybe higher than we had hoped false positives. But I think as we refine these tests, they're going to get better over time. And I read something recently, I think it was yesterday. I think it was Dr. Fauci who said, even if you think you have it and you test negative, you should assume for a period of time, given the outbreak, that you might have it, and then behave accordingly, because there's things we can all do to prevent the spread as a result of it. So while there's always a risk of high or low false positives, if you're in that situation, then you need to behave as if you have it and go back for another test or two and see as we scale up the number that are available.
Great. And actually building on that question, what are you seeing in terms of labs increasing capacity to process the increase in tests? I'm not sure if this would affect is directly related, but yeah.
Yeah, it's related, and it's a great question. So I think one of the challenges we have is on our end, we manufacture the test kits, and the machines that run the tests, the high throughput machines and the lower volume machines as well. When we finish that process, we send it out to labs, research entities, and to hospitals, and they're the ones that actually run the test and collect the data. And so one of the things we're working on right now is to better understand where are the capacity problems and where are there capacity opportunities, and can we relocate some of the testing machine in order to meet the demand that exists right now. And I don't have a good answer for you today, but we've been engaged with the labs in those conversations, and we've been engaged with the White House and other federal agencies on that as well. And we're all trying to better understand where the opportunities are to scale up. Because as you know, in some areas, we're just inundated with requests. In other areas, the demand is not nearly as high.
Great, thank you so much. Another question here, can you say a bit more about your work with FEMA regarding distribution of PPE?
Yeah, so that's been a really tough challenge for us, but I think overall they've done a very good job. I think it's both in PPE and also in the ventilator space, both. In the normal course, we would fill orders that come in from customers and send those directly to the hospital, the health system, whatever it might be, and get them what they need based on our capacity that we have. And then when we scale up, we'd scale up and send as well. The challenge through this crisis has been that a company like those that are members of our organization don't necessarily know all of the hotspots, right? And so the orders come in and everything seems like a hotspot. And so essentially what we've tried to do with FEMA is to coordinate those activities in basically a 50-50 system. So we'll fill part of our orders using ventilators as an example, and then we'd get direction from them on the other half of our orders as well as we're scaling up, so they can send, either we'll send to the stockpile or send directly at their direction to the locations that need these machines or the PPEs. So it's been a blended effort. I think one of the things we both agreed upon early is we didn't want to ship them all to the stockpile and then have the stockpile ship them all to the locations, that it would slow things down. And so that's why we've landed on this blended effort, and we've made good progress in that. The demand is on the PPE, on the basic PPE side, is so dramatic that it's been, honestly, it's been a challenge. But in their defense, I think they've done a good job, or as good as they could under the circumstances.
I think I'm going to step in with a question, Scott. You know, you talked about all the different components in ventilators, and I know that's also the case in diagnostics. There was some talk of a Buy American executive order, and I just wondered where that stood and your perspective on that, and you know how that might impact the work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, another great question. We had a lot of conversation about that and some concerns about that. I think, you know, when we communicated with the administration, I understand the point that they're trying to make. As we've said to them, though, a number of times, now is probably not the best time to try to implement that. Because whether we like it or don't like it, whether we think the system is good or bad, the reality is that the supply chain is distributed all over the world right now. And if we restrict access, it's going to cause other countries to do the same thing. And we didn't want to have that type of backlash, which would really impact our ability to import into this country many of the component parts that we need, and also PPEs. And so we've had quite a back and forth on that. And I feel like, based on my latest conversations, that's the concept is still in play at some point, but it's not urgently in play. And I think they've set it aside until this crisis passes. At least I hope that's the case. And then once we get to the end of it, we can come back and have a conversation about how we can manufacture more in the United States and what it would take to scale up to do that, which is a fair question, but it's certainly not a policy change that we would recommend at this stage.
Okay, very good. We have a few more minutes, so I think we can see if anyone who has called in by phone has a question. So just to remind you, you press *6 to ask your question. All right, well, hearing none, Scott, this was just terrific. We really appreciate your time, and we look forward to continuing to work with you and your wonderful team. Good luck, and let us know how Research America and our Alliance members can help you in any way.
Absolutely. You've been great partners, and we will be in touch. Mary, thank you for being a part of this. Ellie, Jenny, the whole crew, we appreciate all your work. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Scott.
You're welcome.
Terrific. And I believe that Dr. Bright has joined us now. And, it's really a wonderful segue, because Scott talked about the importance of public and private sector cooperation. And Dr. Bright is right in the middle of that. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at HHS and the Director of BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. Dr. Bright actually began his career in vaccine and therapeutics development at the CDC and also has extensive experience in the biotech industry. Dr. Bright, we are so pleased that you could join us today, and we look forward to hearing from you about what BARDA is doing in the COVID-19 response. And I believe you have some slides to share with us.
I do. I have slides. Thank you, everyone. I wanted to see if the slides come up, and we're going to add to the technical difficulty. I've actually had the opportunity to speak on several virtual conferences over the last few weeks, and with mixed results when it comes to slides. So we'll see if this works. But while you're setting that up, I really wanted to spend the time to thank everyone. Thank Mary Woolley in particular for all of the correspondence that we have on an ongoing basis to stay in touch, and the entire Research America Alliance for everything that you're doing, not only in the middle of this response right now, or maybe we're still at the beginning of the response, actually many areas, but throughout, even in non-response times, to ensure the collaboration and the visibility and the important communication about our research and development enterprise and our scientific enterprise to be able to develop critical life-saving medicines and vaccines and diagnostics so we can protect America and protect the world from events such as we're encountering now, but also everyday threats that we face. BARDA, I'm going to go to the next slide. For those who don't know BARDA, we're a component of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness Response, the ASPR, in the department, in the Secretary's office, actually, of Health and Human Services. In ASPR, we live by one mission, and that is to save lives and protect Americans from 21st century health security threats. We know that these threats are many, and we know that they are increasing, not only in number, but intensity around the world, ranging from when we started anthrax, threats that we face with anthrax, but also nuclear proliferation and plague and tularemia and smallpox and pandemic influenza. So a number of chemical and biological and radiological and nuclear events, and then these emerging infectious diseases such as Ebola and SARS, and now this coronavirus. So those are an example of the various threats that we tackle each day in a very strategic way to be able to work with private sector merging with the public sector, as Scott was saying, the need for that, to develop the drugs and vaccines and diagnostics to prepare our country and treat Americans when we're exposed to these. The next slide, BARDA is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. And we have a unique mission. We were set up with a very unique mission, and that is to intentionally bridge public and private, the government and private sector industry in a unique public-private model to be able to accelerate medical countermeasures, so drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics that would be usable for many of these threats we face. And uniquely, many of those threats that we tackle require very unique medical countermeasures. So there isn't an established marketplace for many of those countermeasures, and therefore not only do we support companies to accelerate the development of that medical countermeasure, both financially and also by providing technical expertise, we also manage Project BioShield, which is a very unique mechanism that allows us to procure some of those materials, those drugs and vaccines and diagnostics, in late stage development, and create a marketplace, a pseudo marketplace for those things that don't have an ability to sustain a marketplace out in the regular public marketplace. People are not lining up to buy a smallpox vaccine or an anthrax treatment right now. So we do need to make sure that those companies that make those life-saving medicines and treatments are there when and where we need more of those materials if we are exposed to some of those threats. On our next slide, it just shows a snapshot of the number of companies we worked with. We are only 13 years old, and in those 13 years, we have worked with now over 300 companies, small, large, multinational, some of those tied into academic institutions of all sizes, to be able to identify a solution to many of these threats, to identify a path forward to accelerate the approval and usability of those medical countermeasures. On the next slide, it also goes without saying how critical it is that we work across government and make sure that we're partnering with all of the critical partners in government that are either enabling us or accelerating or collaborating with us in some way in these public-private partnerships to accelerate the development of the medical countermeasure. NIH and CDC and FDA are absolutely integral and critical to our success in accelerating and making available these drugs and vaccines and diagnostics. The next slide shows, it's just if I can just, for one moment, just highlight the success without appearing to be bragging. But over the 13 years we've been in existence, through our public and private partnerships, through industry and a collaboration across government, this model has yielded 54 new FDA approvals, licensures, and clearances for everything ranging from influenza, pandemic influenza vaccines to Ebola vaccines and diagnostics and therapeutics and chemical medical countermeasures, smallpox, anthrax, a full range for burn products, etc., of medical countermeasures that have gone over the finish line, so they can be used, some of these in everyday life, to be able to sustain those for when they're needed for an emergency response. And some of these are in the strategic national stockpile and procured or acquired, so we have those on hand to meet an emergency need when it arises. That being said, on the next slide, as we think about the response, in the middle of a response we're in now for coronavirus, it's COVID-19 disease, it's critical to emphasize the need for speed. Speed is the most critical component of a response, because even though we have many of those or any of those countermeasures that maybe have FDA approval or maybe in late stage development or maybe even in a strategic national stockpile or maybe they're in the marketplace, they are not help at all, and they fail unless they are present in sufficient quantities when and where they're needed. So we have to think about each of these components and operational aspects to make sure we have the capability to surge, scale, and distribute when you need to do so in an emergency response, even when you have a satisfactory medical countermeasure already on the shelf. So on the next slide is one of the mindsets that we are thinking about in BARDA when we stood up a new division of research, innovation, and ventures in 2018. And I think Mary Woolley asked a question to Scott a few minutes ago about innovation and where we bring innovation into this whole system. As we're seeing now as we look at new drugs and new vaccines and new diagnostics in the middle of this response, the critical need to rethink our development and evaluation and production and distribution processes end to end to make sure that we are not wasting any time, making sure that we are thinking strategically and in new ways to be able to make the countermeasures available as quickly as possible. We have begun evaluating, and in this response, we are actually implementing many new strategies to make the medical countermeasures available or get data from medical countermeasures as quickly as possible. And that is only done in collaboration, as Scott mentioned, to the excellent work that the FDA has been doing in this response and working with industry partners of all sizes to be able to move as quickly as possible and rethink or revise even some particular strategies if they potentially slow down a process. The entire time keeping safety first and forefront of everyone's mind as we move aggressively to ensure we're not doing anything bureaucratically that would slow down the potential availability or evaluation of a life-saving drug or diagnostic or vaccine in this outbreak. So in this slide, it just talks about the various areas, either situational awareness, this is the diagnostic or testing, or the test to characterize whether a person is infected or has already been infected and may be immune and able to re-enter the workforce, to how quickly we design a new vaccine or a drug and manufacture and validate those. Validation is, you'll see as we get more and more into the drug development and the vaccine development, a lot of innovation even in the clinical trial design and regulatory review that we all have to put in place to move as quickly as possible. Manufacturing will be done in very unique collaborative ways, and as Scott was talking in his overview a minute ago, talking about the public sector and the private sector and how public and private sector are working more closely in this outbreak, is also really gratifying to see how industry partners are collaborating and teaming in unique ways that I've never seen in my many years in this business, putting profit aside in many cases, putting competition aside in many cases, to bring together the best capabilities to work together to truly have one focus and mission, and that is to end this pandemic as quickly as possible. The next slide, 9, I don't think anyone on the telephone needs to be on the call needs to be reminded, but this is our third coronavirus outbreak in 16 years, and none of them have been really mild outbreaks. I mean, they have all shown to be able to cause significant disease and death in people. And in spite of that, in spite of the surge of attention during an outbreak and the wane of that attention after it appears to go away, we still don't have any FDA approved, cleared, or licensed products to be able to detect or protect or treat someone with a coronavirus infection. So we are adamant this time in this outbreak to bring everything to bear to finish the job this time, to ensure that we have drugs and vaccines and diagnostics that are approved by the FDA for use not only through this outbreak, but for also future coronavirus outbreaks. Slide 10 tells us how we're getting there in government. So it's not an isolated response within government. I think it's really important that everyone understands that we are working very collaboratively within the government, partnerships and communication within HHS and all of our agencies, along with USDA, Homeland Security, Department of Defense, and every agency or department that could contribute to the successful acceleration and availability of a medical countermeasure. As you can imagine, we're getting a lot of interest and a lot of information from private sector and academic sectors. And so it is because of this close collaboration with this interdepartmental, interagency group, task force we have, that we're able to align and prioritize many of those interesting submissions that we're getting. Some of them very interesting, some of them we know quite well, some of those are really novel, and we're open to all ideas. As you're on the line and think about communicating with us, we've also tried to make it very simple for you to reach all of these agencies with a single email, and that is a submission to a special portal we set up at medicalcountermeasures.gov. So if you have a concept, a technology, an idea, an approach, if you submit it there instead of sending it to one of the many email boxes you might reach into, then it's guaranteed in that portal that you will have interagency access and be able to look at that, review that in a very systematic and collaborative way. The next slide, slide 11, shows the various agency-wide engagement we've had with industry and developers and academic community, a number of engagement calls. Some of you, if you've known BARDA in the past, know about our Tech Watch programs. We have modified that to a Corona Watch program, and so we can communicate and tell the developers our priorities and our process. At the same time, they're able to tell us and share with us what they're developing and how and why they think it would be instrumental in the outbreak and where it is in development. The next slide shows you a snapshot of the activity in this area. I won't walk through each of these areas, and I hope you can get the slides afterwards, but to show that we've had over 2,000 submissions into the portal already. I think this is as of the 13th, so 2 days ago, about 2,155 different submissions into that portal. We're about 200 to 300 submissions coming in each day at this point. Lots of ideas. And as those ideas and submissions are reviewed by the interagency task force, then they are ranked and then triaged for a tech watch call or corona watch call. And we've had over 204 of those specific calls with developers to learn more about their technologies. It will be absolutely impossible to get through all 2,200 of those, and that is why they are actually working together to triage those in different areas, and also very quickly to send some of those out to various funding opportunities that are already on the street, either a BARDA broad agency announcement, a number of NIH open solicitations, Homeland Security, DARPA, DOD, CDC. So wherever those are out there, if we see a submission come in that we know would fit squarely into one of those solicitations, we try to communicate that to the offerer as quickly as possible, so we don't have much daylight between that submission and getting connected with a potential funder. On the next slide, slide 13, just a high-level snapshot of the strategy that we are using in BARDA to focus on the highest priority medical countermeasures for this response. We want to accelerate development as much as possible. To do so, we are looking at platform-based technologies, and that's a often loosely used term. When we say platform technology, we are indicating a vaccine platform or a drug or a monoclonal antibody platform that has already been approved or licensed or cleared by the FDA. If it's a diagnostic platform that the FDA has already cleared in the past, it saves a lot of time to add another pathogen onto some of those platform technologies compared to building an entirely new diagnostic technology from scratch, or a drug or vaccine. So we're looking for those technologies that have been approved by the FDA or have been in late stage clinical development. If it's a vaccine that's been in tens of thousands of people around the world for other pathogens or other targets, then there's going to be a lot of experience in that facility. There's going to be a lot of experience in safety data file likely on file at the FDA. And so we'll be able to move more quickly with some of those technologies. We're looking to repurpose licensed products as much as possible. And we're also looking to conduct parallel activities instead of sequential activities. And I'll tell you more about that in the next slide. Mitigating risk. We understand this is high risk to go faster. We have to go faster. Therefore, it's important that we're willing to accept more risk, if that's financial risk, and investing more in technologies and domestic manufacturing, and scale up and scale out at an earlier stage than we might normally do in normal vaccine or drug development. And then we have to be able to understand those risks, take some of those risks, and monitor them closely and manage them as we go through the development cycle. Domestic manufacturing is also absolutely critical. I heard a question just a few minutes ago in the discussion about some of the requirements or discussions about domestic production and investment in medical countermeasures. I think it goes without saying, and as we've seen in previous outbreaks, and as we're seeing in this outbreak too, that many countries with capabilities are already restricting access to or export of those capabilities, or drugs or API or vaccines. We saw a restriction of vaccine distribution in the 2009 H1N1 pandemic as well. So it's really important to be able to keep that in mind as we invest at risk and scaling up and scaling out, that we are, to every extent possible, ensuring that we're building that capacity and that capability in the United States. So as we invest American taxpayer dollars in particular into this capacity building and capability, that we will have an ability to ensure that Americans have access to those drugs and vaccines as they become available. I think it's unreasonable at this point to think other countries would share until they have already fulfilled their own domestic needs. So it's our challenge and our commitment to make sure that we are thinking first too, as we invest, that Americans will have access to the drugs and vaccines that they are investing in for this response. On the next slide, just a quick example illustration. This is an illustrative slide to show how we're thinking in terms of compressing a timeline for development of a new drug or a new vaccine. Traditionally, you would develop a nice preclinical model and perhaps a very small GMP or not even GMP sometimes batch that you can start some early in vitro data and analyzing your immune response or selection of your early drug candidates. And then you would make a bit larger batch and go to an animal model, maybe a bit larger batch and go into phase 1, and you would stop and go and stop and go. And this pathway could take you anywhere from 8 to 10 years to develop a new drug or vaccine. In this response, because of the experience with many of the manufacturers, the platform technologies, because of the close communication and flexibility in many cases and with the FDA, and because of the whole of government approach where we're bringing all the expertise from across HHS agencies onto each project, then we're able to look at ways to compress these timelines to have many different activities going on in parallel while we're monitoring for any signals that would inform us on whether or not we should pull back or divert or bring a different candidate into the front line here. So it is one of those things I described in the previous slide, an at-risk approach. It does cost more to do this. However, the outcome, if successful, would be tremendously rewarding if we could have a drug or a vaccine available sooner. And that is why I state on this, the big red box, that this is an all of government and an all of private sector collaborative approach to be able to work together in an unprecedented way to develop these drugs and vaccines as quickly as possible. On the next slide, slide 15, I'll go into each of the high-level thought processes, strategies for the diagnostics and therapeutics and vaccines, and then I'll show you our current portfolio that we built in BARDA. For the diagnostics, you just had a very nice, extensive discussion on diagnostics, but to give you an overview of how we've been looking at our investments in diagnostics from BARDA up to now, we were focused initially on supporting and accelerating those molecular-based diagnostics that were laboratory-based, so we can put into the commercial marketplace those capabilities with a high throughput instrumentation, with a lot of experience and a proven platform that we can add another test to, another lane to, whatever it might be, to be able to detect for the antigen, the coronavirus, or the SARS-CoV-2 antigen on those. That would allow us to determine acute infection in individuals, understanding the still limitations of a laboratory only based or large laboratory, public health laboratory based diagnostic. We also very rapidly started investing in point of care molecular diagnostics and point of care antigen diagnostics, things that are moving closer and closer to the patient. So away from expanding from a centralized laboratory into those commercial laboratories, into the hospital laboratories, into the doctor's offices, the urgent care centers and beyond, because we wanted to close the timeline, the gap from taking a specimen from an individual to getting that result as quickly as possible for their healthcare provider to inform treatment or social distancing or quarantine or whatever the appropriate activity needs to be. In the third circle on this slide, a huge effort now is ongoing to develop and validate the various serology-based or antibody-based diagnostic tests. It's critical to be able to know if a person has already been exposed to the virus and know if they have antibodies to that virus, especially the right kind of antibodies and the antibodies at a sufficient level to inform them of their protective status. That is the comfort that individuals will seek to be able to return to the workforce and return to society, and I believe get our country back to work and back on track. In addition, the last box, we're not only supporting developers of diagnostics in each of these areas, we're also working very aggressively to get the samples, get the specimens, curate those specimens, put them in a repository at the NIH or CDC, and make those panels and make those reagents available to developers so they can validate their own tests and diagnostics and move the technology forward as quickly as possible. On slide 16, next slide, therapeutics. It's basically a three-pronged approach. As I mentioned already, to move as quickly as possible, we are participating with a number of companies and a number of international organizations to screen every possible drug out there that could impact or react or neutralize or treat a person with this infection, with this virus. So we really are focusing on repurposing FDA-approved drugs and getting as much information about those as possible. There's a lot of interesting information I see and email every day and read in the news every day in the global media about potential for many different drugs or treatments or approaches to work. And we are working as swiftly as possible to get that information and put those therapeutics or those drugs into a randomized controlled study in a very stringent way with a placebo control or the most appropriate control, so we can have the best information possible to inform healthcare workers and actually the world on the benefit or concerns about each of those drugs that we're learning about each day. When it comes to developing a new therapeutic, we're looking at two different approaches. Some of those are targeting the host, blocking the virus activation or blocking or counteracting inflammatory response or cytokine storms. So things that might modulate that host response, and things that target the virus itself. So very specific antiviral drugs that might target the viral replication pathway, or monoclonal antibodies or polyclonal or convalescent convalescent plasma that would target the virus and neutralize it. If we have those things that target the virus, then we can also explore both treatment modalities for those drugs, as well as perhaps prophylactic use of some of those approaches to provide a prophylactic treatment that might bridge up and provide protection for frontline workers and critical workforce until we have a vaccine. The next slide is a little more depth on the repurposing of the vaccine. Of the therapeutics. I don't think I need to go into too much detail on it. We're working with a number of entities, private entities, companies, academic labs, and tied in with centers at the Gates Foundation and global efforts as well to screen the drugs, starting with those approved drugs, looking for hits, looking at those in phase 3 clinical development, looking at those in phase 2 and phase 1, and hoping that we can find as many options as possible in as late stage development as possible, so it doesn't take as much time and effort to be able to find something that works. When we find something that works or might work, we're very rapidly moving into clinical evaluation. We showed that we can do that with our partners in industry and FDA and NIH in particular, with a matter of weeks. When the news came out about the potential for IL-6 receptor monoclonal antibodies to have a positive impact on the inflammatory process seen in many COVID-19 patients in advanced stage illness, we actually moved swiftly with two companies, with Regeneron and with Genentech, to get clinical studies up and running, randomized controlled studies to evaluate the impact of those monoclonal antibodies in clinic. And then, of course, the challenge as we find positive, encouraging data, making the right decision on when to scale up production, ensuring that there's enough capacity. If we find a drug that works, the worst thing worse than not having a drug that works is having one that works and very limited supply. And we already have seen some examples of the consequences of having drugs with promise or hope, and then a very limited access to those, or manufacturing capacity, or limited supply chain. So we're trying to stay 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 steps ahead of the data to know where we should pull triggers to expand and invest in increased capacity at the same time. The next slide is on vaccines. And in vaccines, again, this is a very, how would I say, it's a very active area of development. So there are probably 65 or 70 or maybe 80 different vaccine candidates approaches that I'm learning about from around the world, from academic centers, from small biotechs, from large pharmaceutical companies. And it is a particular challenge to evaluate so many candidates in a very systematic way to understand which of those have the most promise or ability or potential to move forward quickly with sufficient supply, with sufficient capacity, with sufficient data and a regulatory pathway to move into clinical studies and then have large scale quantities of those as early as possible. So we have tried to triage many of those candidates with a few principles. And again, there's never a perfect way to evaluate so many promising candidates. And so we're trying to focus first on those that we think would move swiftly, and second on those that would are from a proven platform. So if it's a licensed vaccine, it's going to give us a lot more clarity on a regulatory pathway. If it's a licensed platform, it's going to most likely have existing capacity, infrastructure to manufacture and scale up, a lot of experience from a group or a company that is knows how to scale a vaccine quickly. And in some cases, it's going to have global reach. So it's going to be a technology or platform that's licensed and proven and likely able to be more easily transferred to multiple manufacturing sites globally, so we can think about a global scale up and production approach for the vaccines in addition to what we need to make domestically. And we also, in the last circle, never want to forget about innovation. So there are some truly remarkable, innovative vaccine approaches and systems and new platforms arising. And some of those we've tracked for decades. Some of those we've learned about in the last few weeks, to be honest with you. And really interesting technology and some really promising attributes. And so along the entire pathway of trying to triage and prioritize, we are looking at innovation as well, because it's sometimes not the first vaccine to the clinic that would have the most promise. It's also not always the most proven or stalwart vaccine that has the most promise. Sometimes is where that innovation comes in that can make a difference in a rapid response for a pandemic. And that innovation could be as simply as an alternate delivery administration method. If I have a vaccine I can deliver orally, that's going to reduce the burden that will for needles and syringes, or it's going to be able to be administered more quickly in some other way. Those types of innovation are things we're also looking at and considering as we look at the many different vaccine candidates. The last slide on the technology, slide 19, again goes into more details. And I think I highlighted this and I talked about our earlier principles for accelerating our overall medical countermeasure approach, but particularly in vaccines, talked about the ways that we are looking to accelerate development as much as possible using platform technologies, repurposed or licensed technologies, and looking at those parallel activities. In the middle, mitigating risk. There's the risk of yield, low yield, mitigating the risk of scalability, the risk of lessons learned from other approaches in vaccine development, and in particular, some early vaccine development for the first SARS outbreak, with the potential for some of those vaccine candidates to have signs of disease enhancement. We have to be fully aware of those and monitor for that, test for that, and mitigate for that if that's what we're seeing. Alternate routes of delivery. The concept of redundancy is absolutely critical. With the outbreak that we're seeing, with the type of virus we're seeing, we have to think about the people who go into the facilities as well, and protecting and securing the people, and knowing that no one facility is going to be sufficient to make the full number of doses we're going to need in our country or globally. So we need to have redundancy and produce that vaccine in multiple facilities at once. And also, if we have individuals or people who have to drop out of the workforce because of getting infected themselves or getting sick or taking care of loved ones or family members, we have to make sure that we are thinking in a redundant manner to ensure that we still have constant, steady flow and meeting an aggressive timeline to have vaccine available. And the very last column there is about the domestic manufacturing. One of the things I'll highlight in that area is the need to think about the raw material supply chain. There's just not enough stainless steel on the planet right now to make enough needles to administer vaccine to the world. There's very limited supplies of borosilicate sand and tubing to make enough vials. And so we have to think strategically and aggressively upfront at risk on how we will ramp up those supply chains, how we move from a thought of a single dose vial to multi-dose vials, and different types of strategies to try to address the constraints on the supply chain that we know we're going to hit as we need vaccine as quickly as possible. Slide 20 shows our landscape, our portfolio so far. So you can see we've invested in a number of therapeutic approaches that meet each of those principles and tiers that I discussed in the previous slide, through convalescent serum and plasma, the hyperimmune serum, monoclonal antibodies, and antiviral small molecule drugs, vaccine candidates, a number of diagnostics in each of those areas, and a number of supporting efforts that we have in place to accelerate animal models and sample collection. Slide 21, don't want to close without acknowledging the 200 people is what we have in BARDA that are all working day and night with that single mission to save lives and move this pandemic out of our future into the past as quickly as possible. Contract officers, technical people working with our company partners hand in hand every day. And on slide 22, the final slide, this is how to reach us. So I know that you all are working with companies or know of companies or ideas and solutions. I encourage you to respond to this call out to submit their information into our portal, medicalcountermeasures.gov. Look at the broad agency announcements that we have already on the street and see if there's a technology that you have or know of that would fit into one of those categories, and submit your information to us as quickly as possible. So I will stop there and hope I have left some time for some questions. Thank you all.
Well, Dr. Bright, that was really terrific. You and your colleagues are certainly firing on all pistons at BARDA, that's for sure. We have passed the 2:30 mark, but if you have a few extra minutes, we do have some questions that have come in. Can you stay with us for a couple more minutes?
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Thank you.
Terrific. Well, I have a question in terms of people who have not submitted to BARDA before or who have less experience. Any tips that you can share? You're getting such a high volume of applications. What should people know to make it easiest for them to convey what they're trying to do?
That's a great question. And instead of, if you have a technology, if you've never worked with BARDA in the past, I really do recommend submitting an inquiry or an abstract or a slide deck or a summary, whatever you can, into that medicalcountermeasure.gov portal. That is a conversation. It's not a formal submission of a white paper or proposal, but it is a submission of your ideas. And our subject matter experts and program officers and across government will arrange a call with you or reach out for more information. And in that conversation, they will be able to give you some really clear guidance on whether or not your technology is something that they're looking for, if it fits into any of the areas of interest, and which agency would be the best agency for you to submit to. That might be, depending on your stage of development, gives you an opportunity to pressure test some of your concepts or strategies you'd like to present to us. So then when you, and that is all market research on both sides, your side and our side. And then if you decide and it's clear that you have something to submit into one of our solicitations, either through white paper or proposal, you have a much better idea. And so when you submit that, it should make the process go much more quickly. It shouldn't be, here's what I think, and then we have to sit back and know that's not what we're looking for in a very technical bureaucratic process. If you leverage that upfront conversation effectively, then you should have a real clear idea on what to submit, and it should move much faster.
Thank you, Dr. Bright. Terry, do you have one or two questions that have come in?
I sure do. Yes, I do. Thank you so much, Dr. Bright. I have one question here. What are BARDA's priorities with the funds it is receiving via the CARES 3 Act?
We are extremely grateful for the funds from the CARES Act. We've received funds in the first supplemental. We've received funds in this next one, the CARES 3 Act, and extremely grateful for Congress for having that confidence in us and our track record of working with industry. We are prioritizing the things that really I've discussed today: how to find the vaccines that need to be accelerated, how to identify the best drugs and get clinical studies moving as quickly as possible so we can identify those best hits, and how to find and scale up the availability of diagnostic and testing as quickly as possible. This seems like a lot of money in the number, so it's a big number. However, as I described the parallel approach and the risks that we have to assume up front, that is why it is incumbent upon us to find ways to accelerate with that type of funding, to accelerate our manufacturing scale up redundancy for large scale production of the drugs and the drugs and vaccines. And so with that, we're able to, unlike in the past, talk with companies and be able to discuss a full development pathway instead of an incremental pathway. One of the challenges we've had in the past, especially with pandemic outbreaks or these novel emerging pathogen outbreaks, is sometimes it's very difficult to find a private sector partner to work with us if it's not clear to them that we would have the funding to support full development of that drug or vaccine. With the sufficient funding that's been given to us so far, we're able to give more confidence to those industry partners that we're going to be able to fully fund and take a product to the finish line and not have to walk away if the disease wanes. We really have, with the support of Congress, with the funding, with our industry partners, a goal now to finish the job and get a coronavirus vaccine and drug and diagnostic approved by the FDA.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And I have one more question here from our very own Mary Woolley. She adds, wonderful, amazing work by BARDA. Thank you and your colleagues. I've heard that approvals of clinical trials for COVID-19 therapeutics are overtaxing IRBs. Might it be possible for BARDA to set up a COVID-19 specific IRB to speed things up?
You know, Mary, I hope you're out there and can hear us. I really appreciate, again, as I said at the beginning, your collaboration and communication throughout all of this. Your leadership is just amazing. That is a really good question, and that is something that we are talking about with our NIH and FDA and CDC colleagues as well, as we think about the various therapeutics coming in. And I wouldn't say that we were naive going into this, but it certainly has been eye-opening going into this, the number of different potential drugs and therapeutics that could be considered or that need to be evaluated. And the way to streamline those evaluations to those different clinical trials, to be able to look at many of them at once instead of one by one by one by one by one is critical. So we're looking at those tools like a streamlined clinical study with multiple arms of adaptive clinical trials, wedge step designs perhaps for evaluating vaccines and enrolling additional candidates or for therapeutics. Many of those lessons learned from the Ebola outbreak are things we're evaluating now. You'll see that government via NIH and FDA and CDC and ASPR and BARDA are really forming a new union in a way that we really have talked about and have attempted and done parts of in the past. But you'll really see us starting to fuse in an unprecedented way to be able to work with the private sector now to find these ways to streamline evaluation of the drugs and vaccines. And that approach that you mentioned there, your streamlined IRB and clinical trial design, is something absolutely in discussion.
Terrific. Well, thank you again, Dr. Bright. That was a terrific presentation, and we know how precious your time is, especially right now. So thank you again. I'm going to turn to a few quick announcements, and thank you to our Alliance members who are staying past the formal end time of this call. We hope you can join us for our next Alliance member call on Monday, which is at 2 p.m. with Dr. Harvey Feinberg, president of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and chair of the National Academy Standing Committee on Emerging Infectious Diseases. Among many areas of expertise, he's an expert on the policy landscape around vaccines. And then on Wednesday, we have a special webinar panel, Understanding the Landscape of COVID-19 Vaccine and Treatment R&D with Dr. Mark McClellan, Dr. Julie Gerberding, and Dr. Stefano Bertuzzi. So we look forward to having you join us next week as well. Thank you again, and stay in touch.
Thank you.